Just wait a second till I can see that the live session started. So I think, yes, we're on. So thank you everybody for joining and for watching us here live on YouTube. Hi, my name is Eva Lianne Veldkamp and I am leading a COPE working group on psychological safety, bullying and SASH in the maritime sector. And you are currently listening in to conversations we are sharing from the members of this COPE working group. This podcast is hosted by Northeast Maritime Institute College of Maritime Science, which created the Center for Ocean Policy and Economics. On today's episode, we focus on reporting mechanisms for sexual assault, bullying, and harassment, looking at it from a psychological and neurological perspective. We are having this talk today with Ms. Pam Kern and Ms. Patti Tutalo. Both of these women have experience at sea as seafarers and have profound understanding of people dynamics and cultures on and off a ship. So Ms. Patti Tutalo, right below on your screen in here, is a consultant and coach that has a passion for empowering and advocating for women while also designing systems to be more inclusive of women. She is a retired US Coast Guard officer, and Patti serves as the Coast Guard's gender policy advisor at the Pentagon for the Secretary of Defense in personnel and readiness. And she also serves as a work-life supervisor responsible for sexual assault prevention and response programs, suicide prevention, and domestic violence victim advocacy. And then on my left side, we have Pam Kern, and she's a licensed psychotherapist and a maritime mental health expert. Her maritime career started in the cruise sector. She served on board of ships as a manager for 18 years, and Pam has a master's degree in advanced practice of clinical social work. She performed clinical mental health research and is specialized in workplace mental health. So we are really very happy to have you joining this live podcast episode on YouTube with us today. And please feel welcome to leave your remarks and questions and suggestions and also maybe experiences in the comments below so we can engage with you during this session. I wanted to say we hope you will all benefit from the information and discussions that are shared in this episode today. So let's start. Patti, could you please tell us something about your view and experience with reporting mechanisms for sexual assault, bullying, and harassment in the maritime sector?
Yeah, so thanks, Eva, for the fun introduction. So this topic, I think, was really I started thinking of this topic and pitched it to Pam and Eva recently, just to try to unpack as we move forward with regulations and unpack what are the reasons why people might not be reporting, or what are some of the barriers or obstacles or challenges. And to really understand those, I immediately thought of Pam, who has been in the mental health field and in the maritime sector, working with people who have experienced trauma. So it just really, I think it's just such an important piece as we move forward with regulation, is to really understand the problem, so to speak. And one thing I wanted to share for the Coast Guard as an example of such barriers is we found that victims weren't reporting because the reporting triggered law enforcement action, an investigation. It triggered a lot of things. And another one is notification of their senior leadership, and the perpetrator obviously would know as well because they're being investigated. So what the Coast Guard, as well as the other Department of Defense services in the US did was and this is specific to sexual assault. So what they did was created a policy that allowed for restricted reporting so that our members could report a sexual assault, but the unit would not know about it. So the organizational leadership would not know, the perpetrator wouldn't know, and it did not trigger law enforcement action or anything through the legal system. Instead, what it did was it provided support, mental health services, medical care for that member. And what they found was sometimes, because of that care and support, they actually came around and did an unrestricted report and went through the legal system. So I don't have the stats on the numbers of that, but it was quite an innovative, I think, way of thinking about the problem. And on the other side of that, unit commanders were so concerned. They said, "Wait a minute, you mean to tell me that somebody was sexually assaulted at my unit and I'm not going to know about it?" And so it took a lot of shifting of the way that we normally think about these things, but it actually increased reports, which is ultimately what we wanted to do. Sexual assault was not increasing. It was just that the reports and women and men felt more comfortable to come forward with reports. So I'll pause there because I just did a lot of talking.
Yes, and maybe Pam, you could take it from there and let us know how you think about that.
Yeah, Eva, thanks so much for the introduction. And Patti, it's great to see you and be here. As a trauma psychotherapist and also my SHIP experience, I try to, infuse the two. It's important to understand that responses, especially victim responses, are all different. So Eva and myself and Patti, we all come from different backgrounds. So how I might cope and both of you might cope could look different. So I actively hear people say, well, her response or his response to trauma or victimization doesn't look like what I thought it would look like. And it's really important to be aware that judgment and the way responses look can be completely different to each person. There's a famous quote by novelist Anais Nin that says, "We don't see things as they are. We kind of see things as we are." So when it comes to judgment of a victim, it will look completely different. And with trauma, what's really interesting, which people might not be aware of, that it's invisible. There's a lot of things with trauma that you do not see. Trauma impairs reasoning, it impairs judgment. So kind of that threat perception of the brain gets changed. So unlike when you break your arm, if you will, you can physically see that. But with trauma, it happens all in the brain. There's a lot of research out there, especially by a Dutch psychiatrist, Bessel van der Kolk, that does research in the mind-body connection. And it's really important to understand that it's not all in your head, it's also in your body and your responses, and can have a lot of long-lasting effects. It changes the neuroplasticity of your brain, and again, will change your reasoning and decision-making. So it's important when victims come forward that it will present different depending, on the person.
Yeah, thanks. That makes a lot of, that's really good for information for you to share. So thanks. And how do you think that people on board of vessels can benefit from this information? Why is it important to know this? Why is it important to be educated on that part of how the mind works?
Yeah, I think it's vital to understand that a lot is invisible, if you will. So a little bit of psychology here. the amygdala in the brain, which is the neural system for processing fearful and threatful events. It's kind of the smoke detector. So on board a ship, we have fire suppression systems, and the smoke detector, when it detects something, it goes off. But when one has experienced trauma, that can be impaired. So the victim, their nervous system can change and wreak a lot of havoc. So there's a lot of physiological as well as psychological responses that can result in things that we might not be aware of. So it's important just to differentiate that every response looks different. And if you see something where somebody might appear a little bit different, to bring something up and say, are you okay? It would be a tremendous probably relief to the other person. Wow, that person mentioned it first. I always hear people say, well, no one said anything to me. I'm suffering and no one said anything. And a lot of times people don't want to say something because they're afraid to make it worse. When on the flip side, the other person might think, wow, that person said it first. So it's kind of a sense of relief, especially when someone experiences trauma. The body is kind of stuck in the traumatic event where it needs to learn that the trauma has passed. So you might have experienced hypervigilance if you've had a traumatic experience on board, where you're kind of like amped up, if you will. And that's the nervous system at play to say, well, okay, wait a minute, I need to kind of like let that go. It's called fight, flight, or freeze. And some people stay stuck in it. And what trauma therapy does is actually try to help kind of unstuck that. So I think in terms of awareness, to be aware when you see something maybe that's a little bit off, say something. And that if you do experience trauma or victimization, come forward as the best as you can, knowing the barriers and constraints, and that if you do experience a traumatic event, that it's the mind-body connection at play, and the responses will look different, and you don't have to benchmark yourself to others.
Yeah,
that makes a lot of sense. Oh, sorry, Patti. Yeah,
oh, no,
please.
it's okay. I love how you bring it back to the science, Pam, and really tying that back together and taking that one step further. I'd love to hear your thoughts. So to set it up, I guess, the question of, well, why don't they just report it? I don't get it. Like we have a method of reporting. So what are, maybe speak to the victim experience from a, like I know in the Coast Guard, for example, we often hear victims don't report because there was alcohol involved, and they're worried that they could get in trouble for the alcohol that they were consuming in that moment, even especially if they're underage. Shame, I know, is often an issue where, and then the other one is that sometimes people don't even know that what just happened. They feel awful. They may be showering multiple times over the weekend trying to get rid of the nastiness of it, but they don't even classify that as a crime of sexual assault or of rape. So I just wondered if you could speak to that a little.
Yeah, absolutely. It's guilt and shame are the two things that I hear actively with clients. They don't want to come forward because guilt, shame, and vulnerability. What will it look like? Humans always want to be accepted, and if they say something, then they're kind of different than others. And the second piece to that is, we don't know if somebody who's come forward has had previous trauma, and if that previous trauma has been unresolved. So you could have trauma upon trauma, and that impairs reasoning and decision-making. And a lot of times people will know that maybe reporting is a good thing, that they should do this, but they will stay in the familiar. And even though they know the familiar is bad, like sitting in the pain, not reporting it, that the uncertainty or unfamiliarity of, well, what if I report, is too great. So they'd rather sit in what's familiar to them, which is, I'm just going to take it and I'm just going to endure it. That's a huge barrier. But humans, we'd rather stay with the familiar than the fear of the, unknown, of maybe even getting help. And that paralyzes people to just stay in the present. And like I said before, trauma impairs reasoning and decision making, and it changes the neuroplasticity of the brain and the way we think and function. And maybe you can remember a time on the ship when you were really nervous and then your stomach hurt. So that mind-body connection of maybe intestinal illness, they've linked trauma to a lot of other chronic conditions, chronic fatigue, fibromyalgia, and a whole bunch, of other diseases. So it's important to look at that mind-body connection and the barriers, to come forward, that you're not alone. You feel like you're alone, but you're not alone. And that there are benefits to reporting. And with those benefits, how can you identify, okay, I feel unfamiliar and maybe feel unsafe. With trauma, it's all about safety. And how do I feel safe? I was in an unsafe situation, and going to report might be unsafe because now I have to report maybe to men or women I'm not familiar with. And those are huge barriers to overcome. It's important to know that you're not alone and that there is help out there.
Thank you so much. I have a question because I think this is really useful information. And for everybody who's listening right now, if you are like having the thought, like I should report somewhere, or you could always reach out to an organization who can help you. I would just like to people know that. And the question I had was, because it sounds like, if you want to overcome those barriers, you need to feel safe. And I think in order to feel safe, you need to trust, right? So you need to trust that you're going to be safe in what you're going to do. So is there something maybe you can share or say about how, if you are looking at it from outside, so on a ship, you might be a colleague of somebody, or you might be a captain or some superior officer. How can you help somebody create that trustful environment, if you will?
From the standpoint of management from the top, how to create that safe environment, like psychological safety, what we talked about. Yeah, it starts from the top and works its way down. Creating an environment that there will be no negative repercussions of coming forward to either speak your opinion, and mutual respect, that everyone has a difference of opinion. That type of environment, really all the research shows, starts from the top and it works its way down, because in a ship system deeply rooted in tradition of a hierarchy, you've got number one, number two, number three in terms of rank, that if it starts from the top, the people below will say, wow, if he or she can do that, then I can do, and then it will follow from there. So my best suggestion is creating psychological safety on board where there are no negative repercussions and there's openness to report, whether it's reporting, victimization, trauma, or just feeling unwell, both physically and emotionally.
I got something on that too, in addition to what Pam just said. What I think that every organization needs to have a policy that has solid, not only reporting mechanisms, but also support, so that is known. I know a good practice is to actually post that in public spaces within the organization. So actually put it on the wall, print it out and put it on the wall. So that's a really good best practice and something that can be taken for action like today. So just print it off and post it on in your mess deck or wherever, eating is, or bathrooms are another great resource for that. We used to put a lot of stuff in the bathrooms because people camp out in there sometimes. And if you put something on the back of the door, they suddenly find themselves reading it. Another one is, I think it's really important, is accountability. and the message of zero tolerance. So that every report will be taken seriously. I think that message is super important. There's some statistic in the United States that only 7% of sexual assault reports are false. So meaning 93% are real. They happened. So we need to, our default should not be to doubt the victim. Our default should be to absolutely side with the victim and assume that they are telling the truth. That's a cultural thing. And as far as accountability, I know some organizations are also looking to but hold bystanders accountable. So those people that are on site and see something happening, to also hold them accountable, which I think is a super good practice, because that's a way to eradicate the behaviors. And finally, I have one other one, and it's another, speaking to the tradition, like Pam just mentioned, of undoing that. I think that the traditional thing on ships is if something is going bad on your ship, it's a reflection on you as the captain. But I want to say that perpetrators, sexual assault perpetrators, are not a reflection of you as the leader. They are criminals that showed up at your workplace, and you as a captain need to hold that perpetrator accountable. Their behavior is not a reflection on you. The reflection on you is not holding that perpetrator accountable and covering up for that perpetrator and allowing that behavior to continue. Perpetrators often have multiple victims throughout their life until they are stopped. They are not a one and done type of offender, which is actually one of the things that victims, once they know that, they'll actually report, not because of themselves, but because they don't want it to happen to other victims. So that's something to think about, is if you have something on your vessel happening, it's been happening for a while. This is not a one and done thing. They're serial perpetrators. So I just wanted to put that point home, because I know when I learned that, my perspective really changed on this topic. So I want to mention that.
That's a really very, very good one to and I would just like to really point that out again. So that means that if you cannot, if you experience something like that, or from the outside, like if you are a colleague of someone who, or the captain, and it's your ship and it happens, that is not your fault, right? You don't have to take that. You don't have to take that. You just have to action it. You just have to, point it out and deal with it, but it's not your action. It's the action from somebody else, right? So that's a really good one to make.
Yeah,
That's
it's not
what you
a
meant.
reflection of their, leadership. I had that exact experience on a ship, and as disclaimer, because my husband's a seafaring captain and we sailed together, it wasn't with him, but with another captain I sailed with, that I had to report a sexual assault of one of my team. And that, I think, played a part in, wow, I can't report this because of, maybe the way he felt. And it was devastating, the what happened, which it didn't go any further. Went to the office, but then it got bounced back. And I think that played a role, but I think on ships too, because there's no boundaries from where you live and work. So that reflection of taking it on a lot more, like, wow, I live here and I work here, my income is based here and everything else, that we take it more personally, because where we live is where we work. And it's hard to kind of separate that. So that's, Patti, that's a really important point, that it is not a reflection. And when it comes to perpetrators, a lot is about access and opportunity. Where's the closest access and what's the best opportunity? And in a contained environment, it's a perfect storm for both. So it is not a reflection of the command. It's the reflection of the access and opportunity of the environment. And of course, it's the perpetrator. And, having people aware that when someone is traumatized, that the response can be just, again, vary. And the trigger could be something like a sound even. And that person can remind them of a previous trauma, completely different situation. But if they've already been traumatized and then they're re-traumatized, then it might look different to what you expect. And I hear this countless times from clients. It'll be a noise, it'll be a smell, and it will take them right back to a previous trauma. And the feeling is the same. So the situation is different, but the feeling is the same. And in trauma therapy, we work to tell the body and the brain, you are now in the present. The past trauma is over. To kind of cut that cord connection, resolve the past so they can live in the present without that trauma. So it's really important to be aware that the response will look completely different depending on where you come from and if you've had previous trauma or not.
Yeah, and Pam, if I could just piggyback off of what you just said. So those triggers of the noise or the similarities of the smell, that can be also a reason why somebody doesn't report, is because they may have froze in that moment whenever the assault was taking place. Correct. And so they said they may come forward, and I mean, if you talk to them, they'll say, I didn't feel like I could come forward because I didn't say no.
Fight, flight, or freeze. Yep.
Yep, because they froze. So that's another really good point of how prior trauma that's unresolved, move forward, you're a vulnerable victim, you get preyed upon, assault happens, you could freeze in that moment. Correct. But I want to say that freezing in that moment and not saying no is not consent either. So
correct, and it's not their fault either if that happens. I think there was a study I saw with Eva Lianne Veldkamp that and I'm not quite sure, so I'm kind of paraphrasing here, re-victimization again is much higher if you have been a victim before because of that impaired reasoning and decision making. So it's really important to have the awareness that it will look different to everybody. And unfortunately, it's invisible. We don't know it. So we tend to make judgments of people on things we can't see, other than the physical response of, a broken arm or a broken leg.
Yeah, and if you look at it from that, it's really a gap in the safety system even, right? So the gap is where you don't see it, but it's there. So I think we're doing a really good job in telling about it, getting the message out there, like sharing your experience, sharing your expertise today. Thank you for that, because I think that's so important and so good to do, because now, when people are watching this, if you are watching this or listening to this, you know that there's more to it than you think or than you know. So thank you very much for sharing this today. And we have to wrap up this session for today, but I just wanted to ask the both of you if you have some final thing you wanted to share about the subject of today, about reporting or about trauma or response. So maybe Patti, you can start.
Sure. I didn't really think about my closing remarks.
Sorry.
No, I'm just so honored to be a part of this movement and this work group. And as we go forward in creating worldwide change on this topic, but I just really appreciate COPE and you, Eva, for what you're doing on really digging into the hard issues, because this is a really difficult issue, and I don't want to downplay how difficult it is when you're in those environments on a ship and something happens, and how that process goes, whether you're in the leadership position, a bystander, or the victim themselves. But it's really, really important to be courageous and also find your allies, because allies are what are going to get you through this. But the other final word is that the number one thing we can do for victims is just support them and believe them. Believing them is is everything to victims. That's, I want to say, for my experience working in this field, it was people just didn't believe them. And that was the worst thing that could happen to them. So thank you.
Yeah. That's almost like a double trauma, you experience trauma and being a victim, and then you have a secondary one by not being believed.
Yes, and then you feel like you don't belong also.
Right.
Maybe.
And that on a ship is, oh my gosh,
That's like,
it's
that's
just
like building up. And that's not necessary. That's not necessary because, you belong there. And I think especially women in the maritime sector, they have to, because they're a minority, and they're in a big, they're a huge minority, they're a very small, huge minority. How do you say that? So you have to be so strong and so brave. So to be working there like from the first point of. So then you have to just believe in yourself that you are strong, because you are. And like Patti said, I think, yes, find your allies. That's a very good one. And if you are like, this is just a shout out to all captains who are watching this. If you are a captain, just create this, environment of safety, where you can be trusted to share whatever is going on. Doesn't even need to be something very, very serious. Can also be something a little bit like you're struggling with or you're thinking of. If you create an environment where you can share all of that, then you are, creating a psychological safe working environment. And I think that's what we all need, right? Doesn't matter if that's what we all need. Doesn't matter if you are a female or male or have that's doesn't matter. It counts for everybody. So maybe Pam, did you have something to add to this?
Yeah, just to address to the people in command, to have the awareness that it will look different with every person, and see things as they are, not as maybe from your experience when it comes to that judgment. And that to victims, you're not alone. And I hope you will seek, the treatment that you need. And to everybody, if you have specific questions about your mental health, please consult, with a suitable and qualified mental health professional. Even though this, podcast is, for informational purposes, but we try to give information, to help, but it might not be specific to you, or it might be, but I would suggest to seek out, your own mental health treatment. A conversation can be the start to a cure. And I hope going forward, whether that starts with a friend, someone you know and trust, or a mental health professional, but there is help out there.
There is. And thank you for letting all of us know. And thank you also for sharing your insights and expertise, both Patti and Pam. Thank you so much for being on this show today with us. And we're really grateful to have you on our working group and also to have you on this podcast episode today. So I think we will wrap this up for today. Thank you for listening. And please know that we are sharing more of these talks. We are trying to do it every 2 weeks from the COPE working group on psychological safety, bullying and harassment in the maritime sector. So if you're interested in our work, please take a look at the website of the Center for Ocean Policy and Economics, that is thecope.org, or feel free to look us up on social media and send us a DM. That's also possible. So thank you for listening and for watching us on YouTube today. And well, yes, we hope that this information was beneficial to you. And let us know if you liked it, if you benefited from it. We would love to hear from you if you did. So thank you very much. And we will love to see you back in the next episode.